Winter horror stories from snowy, isolated places. The biting cold, the howling winds, and the thick blanket of snow seem to hold more than just the chill of winter. In the remote, isolated corners of the world, the quiet beauty of snow-covered landscapes hides unsettling secrets. These 10 stories are true accounts from people who ventured into snowy, desolate places and encountered horrors they never could have imagined. If you're not careful, you might never leave these frozen wildernesses. Story 1. The cabin with too many footprints. The cold air hit you as you drove deeper into the Canadian wilderness, the only sound the hum of your engine. After a long journey, you finally reached the secluded cabin your grandparents built. The snow, untouched and pristine, blanketed everything in white. The cabin was just as you remembered, rustic and peaceful, offering the perfect escape from the chaos of modern life. The next morning, as you stepped outside, something caught your eye. Fresh boot prints in the snow, leading up to the cabin and disappearing into the woods. There were no vehicle tracks, just the eerie prints in the snow. Your heart raced with unease. Who could have come so far into the wilderness? Unable to ignore your curiosity, you followed the footprints. The deeper you went into the forest, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if something was watching you. The trees cast long shadows, and every rustle of branches made you more nervous. Then, the distinct crunch of snow beneath heavy boots broke the silence. You spun around, but there was no one in sight. Panic surged as you turned back toward the cabin, the sound of footsteps still echoing behind you. You ran back, slamming the door behind you and locking it, your heart pounding. It dawned on you that someone had been out there. Someone had been following you. The realization chilled you to the bone. As the storm outside intensified, the knocking began. At first, it was soft, like someone testing to see if you were inside. Then, louder. You froze, the voice outside calling your name in a low, guttural whisper. Fear gripped you as you realized the presence was no accident. The thing wasn't seeking shelter. It was hunting you. Footsteps circled the cabin, growing closer. The door rattled again. You were trapped, alone in the wilderness with whatever was out there. The knocking continued, relentless, as if the creature knew you were inside. And in the snowy silence, the cabin, once your refuge, had become a prison. Story: The Silent Forest Screams. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip in the snow-covered forest, far from the chaos of everyday life. Justin and I set up camp beneath the stars, a warm fire crackling as we relaxed with drinks, enjoying the serene night. But that peace was shattered by an ear-piercing scream that cut through the stillness. Distant at first, the sound echoed through the trees, filling the air with terror. It lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. We froze, unsure of what to do, the wind howling around us. The silence that followed was even worse. Then, the scream came again, closer, much closer this time. Our instincts told us something was wrong. Grabbing our knives, we ventured into the woods, the snow crunching under our boots. The trees loomed above, casting long shadows as we walked deeper into the dark forest. Every step made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We weren't alone. In the clearing ahead, we found it. A freshly killed deer, its eyes wide open in terror, staring at us. But that wasn't what stopped us dead in our tracks. Across the clearing, standing motionless, was a man. His expression was cold, his gaze blank and unblinking. He stood there without explanation, just watching us from the shadows. The sight was chilling, and the air felt suffocating. There was no reason for him to be there, no explanation, no purpose. We didn't wait to find out. Fear surged through me, and we turned and ran back to camp, our hearts pounding in our chests. We packed up quickly, not speaking. The image of the man and the deer's lifeless eyes burned into our minds. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that the man was still watching, still waiting. That night, the woods felt alive with a sinister presence, and it still haunts me to this day. Story 3, the Christmas Eve delivery. It was supposed to be just another typical Christmas Eve delivery for DoorDash, a night filled with the usual chill of winter air and the quiet hum of holiday excitement. The roads were clear, but the weather was bitterly cold, the streets of the town quieter than usual, as Christmas shopping was winding down. I had delivered a few orders already and was looking forward to finishing up my shift. But when I received an order to deliver food to a cabin in the woods, I didn't think twice. It wasn't uncommon to get deliveries to more remote locations, and the GPS showed it was just a short drive into the forest. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as I drove deeper into the woods, the feeling of unease began to settle in. The roads grew narrower and the trees seemed to close in on either side. The usual sounds of civilization disappeared, leaving only the crunch of tires on snow. The cabin, when I finally saw it, was small and isolated, so isolated in fact that it seemed like something out of a ghost story. The only light came from a flickering lamp near the door, casting long shadows on the snow. There was an eerie stillness about the place. No movement, no other cars in sight. Just an unsettling silence that hung in the air. I approached the door and knocked, my breath visible in the freezing air. The door creaked open almost immediately, and a man stood there, his face shadowed but his smile wide, almost too wide. "Come in," he said in a low voice. "The guests are waiting for you." I hesitated, my hand still on the door, feeling a pang of doubt. Something about his voice sounded off, and the invitation, too eager and too forced, made my skin crawl. But I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, it was Christmas Eve. What could go wrong? I stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the laughter. It echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, loud and boisterous, but oddly hollow. It didn't sound right. It was too loud for such a small cabin, too chaotic, like something was forcing the laughter out, not letting it come naturally. My gut tightened as I stood there, unsure whether to move forward or leave. The man closed the door behind me, and I stood in the dimly lit hallway, listening to the laughter grow even louder. But as I took another step, the noise suddenly stopped. A cold silence filled the space, as if the air itself had thickened. The stillness felt unnatural, like the moment before a storm. I looked back at the man, his smile now gone, replaced by an unreadable expression. His eyes flickered, almost as if he was confused by the sudden quiet. "It's odd, isn't it?" he said, his voice low, almost too calm. "The house is always so full of life, until it's not." The unease that had been gnawing at me exploded into a full-blown alarm. Something was deeply wrong. I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't just a delivery. This was a mistake. I glanced down the hallway where the laughter had come from. But now, it was too quiet. The house was dark, far darker than it should have been for a place supposedly full of people. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, as though the very air around me had changed. My pulse quickened, and I knew I had to leave. I didn't belong here. Without thinking, I dropped the bag of food at my feet and bolted for the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled towards my car, the crunch of my footsteps seeming too loud in the deep silence. I fumbled with my keys, desperate to get the engine started. As the car roared to life, I glanced up at the cabin. The man was standing in the doorway now, watching me, his face expressionless, his posture unnervingly still. I drove off quickly, my hands gripping the wheel, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What was that man doing there? Where were the guests he had spoken of? Why had the laughter stopped the moment I entered? I never made another delivery to that cabin, or anywhere nearby again. There was something in the air that night, something sinister and wrong that I couldn't explain. The cabin, the man, and the silence haunted me long after I left. The world outside was bustling with Christmas cheer, but inside that cabin, I had stepped into something far darker, something I was never meant to witness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped with my life. Story 4. The Night Watcher. It was a cold winter night, and I was working a late shift at a small, family-owned grocery store. The store was nearly empty, the quiet broken only by the hum of the freezer and the occasional shuffle of a few lingering customers. The night dragged on, but something felt off when I noticed a man standing just outside the window. He wasn't knocking or waving. He was simply staring at me. His eyes locked onto mine, and a shiver ran down my spine. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I turned away to distract myself with stocking shelves, but the unease never left. When I checked the window again, the man was gone, but moments later, I heard a soft, eerie laugh echoing from somewhere inside the store. It sounded wrong, too high-pitched and childlike. My heart raced as I turned the corner, and there it was. Several boxes knocked over on the floor, creating an unsettling mess. Someone had been here, watching me, hiding in the aisles. Panic surged as I realized I wasn't alone. I hurriedly looked around, but all I could feel was the oppressive silence of the store. Then I saw him. He was inside, standing at the far end of the aisle, his eyes still locked on mine. Without thinking, I ran for the door, heart pounding. I managed to unlock it, escaping into the freezing night. Once I was in my car, I called the police, my voice trembling as I explained what happened. The officers arrived and searched the store, finding the man hiding behind the shelves, holding a knife. Later, the police reviewed the security footage. The man had sneaked in through the back door, watching me for who knows how long. The laugh wasn't a mistake. It was part of his twisted game. That night could have been my last. The memory of his cold stare and the strange laugh still haunts me, and I haven't worked a late shift since. The store, once familiar, now feels like a place where terror lurked just beneath the surface. Story 5. The Uber driver who wasn't. The night had been long, too long. The music, the laughter, the flashing lights of the party, all blurred together in a hazy fog as I stumbled out into the cool night air. The streets were quieter now, the world around me still and calm after the chaos. I needed to get home, but I was drunk, enough that my head spun, but not enough to make me forget the basics. I called an Uber, knowing it was the safest option. When the car pulled up, I barely looked at it as I climbed inside, settling into the back seat and adjusting myself. The interior of the car was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine. The driver didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I was too tired to make small talk, too drunk to care. But as I sat back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The driver's eyes, reflected in the rearview mirror, were locked on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. His gaze wasn't just a casual glance. It was fixed, unblinking, like he was studying me, trying to read me in a way that made my skin crawl. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself I was just imagining things, but the feeling didn't go away. It was as if his eyes were following every movement I made. I checked my phone to distract myself, and that's when it happened. The Uber app buzzed, and I saw a message. "Driver has arrived at pickup location." But I was already in the car. My heart skipped a beat. Something about the message didn't sit right, but I couldn't place why. I turned to the driver, forcing myself to speak. "Where are we headed?" I asked, my voice slightly slurred. He didn't respond right away. When he finally did, his voice was cold, emotionless. "Wherever you need to go," he said, his eyes never leaving mine in the mirror. I glanced out the window, expecting to see familiar streets, but what I saw made my stomach lurch. We were heading in the wrong direction, away from my neighborhood, away from everything that should have been familiar. My pulse quickened, and panic began to creep up my spine. I checked my phone again, trying to calm myself, and there it was. A new message. "Where are you?" My mind raced. This wasn't a normal Uber ride. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. My instincts screamed at me, but I tried to ignore them. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The car slowed at a red light, and in that moment of hesitation, a surge of fear took over. Without thinking, I unbuckled my seatbelt, pushed open the door, and bolted out onto the sidewalk. I heard the car jerk forward, but I didn't stop running. My feet pounded against the pavement as I sprinted away, the cold air burning my lungs, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. I kept running until I found a crowded area, a well-lit street where people were still out. I found safety in the buzz of life around me, in the familiarity of the world that hadn't yet quieted down for the night. I called another Uber, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline. Later, I tried to make sense of what had happened. How had I gotten into the car with the wrong driver? Why had he been so focused on me, watching me with that cold, empty stare? What if I hadn't trusted my instincts, hadn't bolted when I did? The thought sent a chill through me. It could have ended differently, far differently. The fear still clings to me, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. And I'll never forget the sensation of those eyes in the rearview mirror, watching me, waiting. I learned that night how important it is to listen to that gut feeling, even when everything else tells you to ignore it. Sometimes your instincts are the only thing standing between you and something far worse. Story 6. The Locked Room. The house was eerily quiet, save for the howling wind outside as the snowstorm raged relentlessly against the windows. Inside, everything felt unnervingly still, as if the storm had swallowed all sound, leaving the house in an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of night where the walls themselves seemed to hold their breath. The cold seeped into the bones of the old house, but I had grown accustomed to the isolation. There was something peaceful about the solitude, even with the storm howling outside, but that night something felt different. It started with a noise, a dull thud from upstairs, faint but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps the house settling under the weight of the snow, but it was too distinct, too purposeful. My heart skipped a beat as I paused, straining to listen. Nothing. The house was silent again, but the unease lingered in the air. I shrugged it off, thinking it was my imagination, and tried to return to the comfort of my book and the warmth of the fire. But as the hours passed, the stillness was broken again, this time more forcefully, a loud thud followed by the unmistakable sound of something shifting, something moving upstairs. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitated. Was I imagining things? Had I missed something before? With a growing sense of dread, I stood up and made my way to the stairs. The sound of the storm outside, almost comforting compared to the tense silence inside. I reached the second floor and walked cautiously down the hallway. But when I checked each room, There was nothing. No one. No sign of anything out of the ordinary. I breathed a little easier, trying to convince myself that it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But then, as I stood there in the hallway, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint click. It came from the spare bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, but something was wrong. It was locked. I knew I hadn't locked it. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, but just as my fingers brushed the door, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving on the other side. Panic surged through me. My heart raced as I realized I wasn't alone. Someone was in that room. Someone had been hiding in my house, and I hadn't known. The walls closed in on me as I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to process what was happening. My breath quickened, and I scrambled to the phone. The words barely left my lips as I called 911, my voice shaky, barely audible. Someone's in my house. I'm not alone. The minutes felt like hours as I waited, too terrified to move, too scared to make a sound. When the police finally arrived, they rushed through the door, their flashlights sweeping across the rooms. But there was no sign of anyone. The room remained locked. They forced the door open, and as it creaked inward, my eyes scanned the space, searching desperately for any sign of the intruder. But there was no one there. What they did find, however, made my blood run cold. Grocery bags, still containing food wrappers and leftover snacks, sat piled up in the corner. Blankets were folded neatly beside them. It was clear someone had been living in that room, hiding there for days, quietly watching me. The officers searched the house from top to bottom, but the intruder was long gone. There was no trace of them anywhere. No footprints in the snow outside. No sign of forced entry. It was as if they had simply vanished. The worst part, they had been in the house all along. While I slept, unaware, someone had moved silently through the rooms, hiding, watching, waiting. I had walked past that room countless times, not knowing that someone was behind that locked door, living in the shadows. They had been so close that I could have brushed against them without ever knowing. The police never found out who it was, and the house was never the same after that night. The silence that once felt so comforting now felt suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made me jump. The thought that someone had been so close to me, so close to my every move, haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of that locked door, the realization that I had been watched for days, moving through my life unaware of the danger that had been lurking just out of sight. To this day, I never feel truly safe in that house. The memory of those footsteps, the eerie click of that locked door, will always be with me, and I'll never forget the chilling truth. Someone had been there right under my nose all along. Story 7. The Motel of Forgotten Souls. The storm had been growing stronger for hours, the rain relentlessly pounding against my car. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and I felt my exhaustion weighing heavily. I had been on the road for what felt like forever, and I needed to find shelter. Then, in the distance, I saw a faint glow, a motel sign flickering weakly in the storm. It was isolated, sitting alone at the edge of nowhere, and in the storm, it seemed like a beacon of safety. Without thinking, I pulled off the highway and drove toward it. The parking lot was nearly empty, the air thick with silence. The motel looked old, worn, and abandoned, but I was too tired to be picky. I parked my car and walked toward the front door, only to find it locked. The lobby was dark, and I could hear muffled voices coming from inside, though I couldn't make out any words. A chill ran down my spine. Something felt off, but I dismissed it as my imagination. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. After a few moments of standing in the rain, two figures emerged from the shadows. Two men, dressed in dark clothing, appeared slowly. Their faces were partially obscured by their hats, and they moved with unnerving deliberation. "Can you help us?" one of them asked. "Our car broke down. We need a jump start. Do you have cables?" The request seemed innocent enough, but something about their presence made me uneasy. I hesitated, but told them I didn't have jumper cables. Instead of leaving, they didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me. I forced a smile, trying to dismiss my growing discomfort. "I'm sorry, I don't have any," I said, taking a step back. But they didn't retreat. They closed the distance, watching me intently, and the air between us felt heavy. I turned toward my car, desperate to leave, but before I could get in, one of the men knocked on my window. My heart raced as I realized they were getting too close. I quickly started the engine and reversed out of the parking lot, my mind racing. I didn't look back as I sped down the highway, my heart still pounding in my chest. Once I was far enough away, I pulled over to calm down. My hands were shaking, and I tried to make sense of what had happened. Later, I called the police and reported the incident. They arrived at the motel, but by the time they got there, the men were gone. The motel was eerily empty, locked up, and appeared to be abandoned. There was no sign of anyone. The police checked the area, but they found nothing. No car, no trace of the men. What had they really wanted? Why had they approached me so strangely? I never found out. The fear from that night still haunts me. The strange behavior of those men, the silence of the motel, the way they followed me without a word. It all felt wrong. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. That night could have ended very differently. Story 8. The Night at the Cabin. It was a snowy winter evening when I arrived at the cabin, seeking solitude and peace. The place was isolated, nestled deep in the forest, surrounded by an endless blanket of snow. The cabin itself was charming, rustic and inviting, with a crackling fire in the hearth that offered warmth against the bitter cold. I was eager to escape the chaos of daily life and unwind in this quiet, remote spot. For the first few hours, everything felt perfect. The snow fell gently outside, and the silence was serene, broken only by the occasional crackle from the fire. I curled up with a book, letting the calm of the place wash over me. But as night settled in, things began to feel off. It started with a faint sound, almost imperceptible at first, a soft crunching noise outside. I froze, straining to listen. My heart skipped a beat as I wondered if someone was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The wind howled and the snow whirled around me, but the surroundings were eerily still. No sign of anyone. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind, but the unease didn't go away. I returned to the cabin and locked the door, trying to shake off the feeling. But then, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, this time clearer. The sound of knocking. Soft at first, like a whisper against the wood. It wasn't the sound of wind or branches, but something deliberate. I sat up in bed, listening intently, but when I checked the windows and doors, no one was there. The knocking continued intermittently, growing louder and more frequent as the night went on. I locked every door and window, but the fear crept in. I could feel the cold of the room deepening, as though the warmth was being sucked out of the cabin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Was I alone? Or was someone, or something, outside, waiting? My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. The knocking was too persistent to be a figment of my imagination. I grabbed my phone, but there was no service in this isolated corner of the world. I was entirely alone, stranded in the wilderness with no way to call for help. The wind continued to howl outside, but the knocking wouldn't stop. I lay in bed, frozen with fear, unable to move. The room grew colder still, and my breath became visible in the air. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whoever, or whatever, was out there knew I was here, and they wanted me to hear them. Then, the sound of footsteps. Quiet at first, then louder, as though someone was walking along the porch. My heart raced in my chest as I rushed to the window, flashlight in hand. But again, there was nothing. The snow was undisturbed, the darkness outside impenetrable. The knocking grew louder, more urgent, and I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted from the bed and grabbed my belongings. Without a second thought, I rushed out of the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest as I fought through the snowstorm to my car. I couldn't stay there a moment longer. I drove through the storm, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. The terror of the night still gripped me as I pulled into a well-lit gas station, shaking uncontrollably. I never went back to that cabin. The memory of the knocking, the footsteps, the cold, everything about that night lingered long after I left. I don't know what happened that night or who or what was out there, but I'll never forget the overwhelming sense that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The cabin, once a peaceful retreat, had turned into a place of terror. To this day, I wonder if anyone or anything was ever really there, or if it was just my mind playing tricks in the stillness of that isolated, snowy night. Story 9. The Frozen Path. The night was frigid, the kind of cold that seemed to settle deep into your bones, making every breath a visible puff of mist in the air. The snow was thick underfoot, and the world around me was wrapped in an eerie, peaceful silence. I had walked this path countless times before, a familiar trail through the forest, the trees lining the way as I made my way through the snow. It was always a calming walk, a place where I could clear my mind and enjoy the stillness of nature. But tonight, everything felt different. As I walked, the familiar sounds of the forest, the wind rustling the trees, the distant chirp of animals, seemed absent. It was just the steady crunch of snow under my boots, echoing in the quiet. But something else was there, something I couldn't shake. It started as a faint feeling at the back of my mind, a sense that I wasn't alone. The deeper I walked, the stronger it grew. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. But they weren't mine. The sound was faint at first, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was following me. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat, and turned around quickly, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, snow-covered path stretching behind me. I frowned, thinking it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind, and started walking again. But the footsteps persisted. They echoed behind me, matching my own rhythm. I stopped again, this time more cautiously, and spun around. Nothing. I was alone, but the footsteps were still there, reverberating through the thick snow. The sound was getting louder now, as if whoever, or whatever, was following me had quickened their pace. My pulse quickened as a wave of unease washed over me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind, the snow, maybe some animal moving through the trees. But the feeling of being watched, of something following just out of sight, refused to fade. I continued down the path, but now I was walking faster, my every step echoing in the heavy silence. The trees, normally a comforting presence, seemed to loom over me, their dark branches casting long shadows in the dim light of the moon. The path led to nowhere, a dead end, as it always did. But tonight, it felt different, as if the deeper I went, the further I strayed from safety, from the familiar world. The snow crunched louder under my boots, each step taking me further into the unknown. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. If I turned around, would there be someone waiting for me? The fear was slowly building, growing with every echoing footstep. The further I walked, the more oppressive the silence became, until the path itself seemed to swallow every sound. The trees closed in on me, the snow deeper, and my own breath louder in my ears. I knew I needed to turn back, to leave, before whatever was following me caught up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting in the dark, just out of reach. The path that had once been so familiar now felt like an endless maze, leading me deeper into a place I wasn't meant to be. I finally turned, my heart racing, and started back toward the safety of home. The footsteps were still there, still echoing behind me, and I quickened my pace, my boots slipping slightly in the thickening snow. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking in the darkness. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder one last time. There was nothing, no one, but the feeling of being followed, of something close by, lingered. The path had always been simple, straightforward, but tonight it felt like I had ventured too far, too deep into a place where the familiar was no longer safe, where the quiet was hiding something more sinister. The sound of my footsteps, the weight of being watched, it would stay with me even as I left the path behind and made my way back home. Story 10. The Snowstorm Stranger. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending the snow swirling in chaotic patterns across the yard. I had been curled up by the fire, enjoying the warmth and the comfort of my cozy home, feeling completely at peace despite the storm raging outside. The storm was fierce, its icy fingers clawing at the walls, but inside, everything felt safe and still. That was until I heard the knock. It was sharp, sudden, and out of place, cutting through the silence of the room. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Who could be out there in such a storm? No one in their right mind would be out in weather this brutal. I pushed the feeling of unease aside, convincing myself that it was probably just a neighbor needing help, or perhaps someone who had gotten lost in the snowstorm. I walked to the door and opened it, only to be met by a man standing on my doorstep. His clothes were soaked from the snow, his hair matted against his forehead. He looked disheveled, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes, wild, frantic, locked onto mine. His breath was visible in the cold air, a cloud of steam rising as he spoke. "Please, can I use your phone?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I need to call someone. My car broke down and I need help." There was something wrong about him. His words didn't quite make sense, and his voice lacked the steadiness I would expect from someone who genuinely needed help. It was almost frantic, as if he was trying too hard to sound convincing. His eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to pierce right through me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "I'm sorry," I said, taking a small step back. "I can't let you in. It's too dangerous out there. You should try to find shelter elsewhere." I didn't want to be rude, but there was a growing instinct inside me telling me to stay cautious. The man didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring at me for what felt like an eternity, his eyes not leaving mine. Finally, he spoke again, his voice a little more desperate, almost pleading. "Please, I just need to call someone. I don't know what's happening. I'm lost." A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't let it show. I nodded stiffly and closed the door, locking it quickly. My hand trembled as I leaned against the wood, trying to calm my racing heart. But before I could even turn away, the knocking began again, soft at first, like the wind had blown something against the door. But then it came again, louder, more insistent. The man was still out there. My mind raced as I stood there, paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? But what would I tell them? A stranger was knocking on my door in the middle of a snowstorm. It seemed ridiculous. but the fear was real. I pressed my back against the door, the sound of the knocking reverberating through the wood, my pulse pounding in my ears. I glanced through the peephole, but all I could see was the swirling snow. No sign of the man, just the thick curtain of white outside. The knocking continued. It was getting louder, more urgent. Each knock seemed to push against my sense of safety, like something was trying to break through, to get inside. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow and quick. The storm outside raged on, but the feeling in my chest grew heavier with each passing second. I couldn't shake the image of his eyes, wild and desperate, watching me from the other side of the door. Was he still out there? Was he waiting for me to open it again? The hours felt like they stretched on forever, the silence in the house almost suffocating. Eventually the knocking stopped, but the unease remained. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid to move from my spot on the couch, my eyes constantly scanning the windows, the door. Every gust of wind felt like it could be a footstep, every shift in the storm a sign that he was still out there, waiting. I never found out who that man was or what he truly wanted, but the fear that gripped me that night has never faded. The snowstorm may have passed, but the memory of those wild eyes, the relentless knocking, and the strange intensity of his presence lingered. I never opened the door again, and every winter night since, I still wonder, what would have happened if I had?